The golden light of late afternoon was doing that magical thing it always did to our small garden, making everything look like it had been painted with honey. I stood at the kitchen window watching the light dance across the flower beds while stirring the gravy for tonight's dinner. The radio was playing some old song that made me hum along without even thinking about it. The smell of rosemary chicken was already beginning to fill the whole house, mixing with the warm spring air that drifted through the open window. It was one of those perfect Tuesday evenings that felt like a soft, familiar hug from life itself. Outside, could see Mark wrestling with his favorite challenge, that stubborn rose bush that had been giving him trouble for months. My husband, of 32 years, was bent over it, his gray hair catching the sunlight as he worked. He'd been determined to make that bush bloom since early spring, and I had to smile watching him. Some things never change. And Mark's patience with his garden was one of them. Everything felt peaceful and ordinary, the way I liked it best. The kind of evening where you can almost feel yourself sinking into contentment. I had no idea that this calm, lovely moment was about to change everything. The phone had rung about an hour ago. I remember because I was just taking the chicken out to check on it when I heard it. Ark answered in the den, and I could hear his voice that deep. Familiar rumble, but I couldn't make out the words. He was talking for quite a while, longer than usual for Mark, who never was much for long phone conversations. When he finally walked into the kitchen, I noticed something different about his face right away. There was a look there I hadn't seen in years, surprise mixed with something else. Something that made me stop stirring and turn to face him completely. I asked, setting down my wooden spoon. Mark leaned against the kitchen counter, running his hand through his hair the way he always did when he was thinking. "That was David," he said slowly, like he was still trying to believe it himself. "David," I repeated, feeling my eyebrows rise. "David who?" "David Miller," Mark said, and suddenly that funny look on his face made perfect sense. David Miller. Now, that was a name I hadn't heard spoken out loud in our house for almost 20 years. Maybe longer. David Miller, Mark's best friend from college, his partner in all those wild adventures. He sometimes told me about when he was feeling nostalgic. I could still picture David clearly, even after all these years. Tall and thin, with that mess of brown hair that never wanted to stay in place, and a laugh that could fill up a whole room. He was always moving, always full of energy, like he had too many ideas to fit in one person. Those two had been like brothers back in college. Mark always said David was the brave one, the one who pushed him to try new things, to take chances. They'd been inseparable for years, calling each other every week, visiting back and forth, including each other in every big moment of their lives. But then, life did what life does. It pulled them in different directions, slowly but surely. David got a job offer out west, something with computers and technology that I never quite understood. The phone calls became less frequent. The visits stopped. The Christmas cards eventually stopped coming too. It wasn't that they stopped caring about each other. Suppose just ... life, work, responsibilities, distance. Heck. The way friendships sometimes fade even when you don't want them to. "David Miller," I said again, this time more to myself than to Mark. "Well, I'll be." What did he want? "Is everything okay?" Mark's face broke into a slow smile, the kind I hadn't seen in a while. "He's in town," he said. "It's just for a couple of days, some kind of business trip. He asked if he could come by tonight. Said he'd really love to see us." Tonight. I glanced at the oven, then at the clock on the wall. It was already past 6. "Well, that's quite a surprise." "It's a good surprise, though," Mark said quickly, and I could hear the excitement starting to creep into his voice. "Right?" "I mean, it'll be good to see him." "Of course it will be," I said, though my mind was already racing ahead to all the things I'd need to do. 20 years. What would David be like now? Would we even recognize each other? Would we have anything to talk about? I remembered David as this young man who seemed to know everything about everything, who could make Mark laugh until his sides. Hurt, who always had a kind word for me, even when I was just Mark's nervous girlfriend, trying to figure out if I fit into his world. Did he say anything about ... Well, about his life. Is he married? Does he have kids? I asked, realizing how little we knew about David's life now. He didn't say much, Mark admitted. Just that he was in town and wanted to see us. He sounded like David. Maybe a little older, but still David. I felt that familiar flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness that comes with unexpected company. Well then, I suppose I should. I looked around the kitchen mentally, making a list of everything I'd need to do. He said he couldn't stay for dinner, Mark added, seeing the look on my face. Just wanted to drop by, maybe have a drink, catch up for a bit. He's flying out early tomorrow morning. Oh, I said, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Relief because I wouldn't have to stretch our dinner to feed 3 people. But disappointment because it meant we'd only have a short time together. Well, that's probably for the best. I don't think I have enough chicken anyway. But even as I said it, I was already thinking about what I could put together. Maybe some of those crackers I'd been saving, and the good cheese from the farmer's market. Some of those little tomatoes from Mark's garden. It really will be good to see him, I said, and I meant it. There's something special about people who knew you when you were young, who remember you before you became who you are now. They hold pieces of your history, reflections of a younger version of yourself. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:15. Mark had just come in from the garden, his cheeks red from the sun and a streak of dirt across his forehead. He looked so much like the young man I'd fallen in love with that it made my heart skip a little. I'd changed into my favorite knit dress. Nothing too fancy, but nicer than my everyday clothes. I'd run a brush through my hair and put on a little lipstick, just enough to feel like I'd made an effort. It felt important somehow. This reunion. With someone from our past, Mark opened the front door and I stayed back for a moment, just watching. The man standing on our doorstep was definitely David. But also definitely not the David I remembered. He was older, of course. We all were. The tall, thin frame had filled out into something more solid. The wild brown hair was now mostly gray, cut neat and professional. There were lines around his eyes, though I was happy to see they looked like laugh lines mostly. But when he smiled, when that familiar grin spread across his face, he was exactly the David I remembered. Warm, genuine, maybe a little shy. Ark. "You old dog," David said, and his voice was deeper than I remembered. But still friendly, still carrying that hint of mischief. "David, look at you," Mark said, pulling him into one of those hearty hugs men give each other, complete with backslapping. "Come in, come in." They stepped into our hallway, and David's eyes found mine immediately. "Sarah," he said, his smile getting even wider. "Wow, you look exactly the same, still as beautiful as ever." I felt heat creep up my neck and into my cheeks. "Oh, you're just being kind, David," I said, but I was smiling too. "You, on the other hand, look very distinguished." "Distinguished," David laughed, stepping forward to give me a light, friendly hug. "That's just a nice way of saying old, isn't it, Sarah?" The hug was comfortable, easy, natural, like no time had passed at all. "Well, if you're old, then what? Does that make us?" I asked. "Wise," David said, without missing a beat. "Definitely wise." We all laughed, and just like that, the nervousness I'd been feeling melted away. This was David, our David, just older. We settled into the living room, and Mark poured us each a small glass of sherry. We hardly ever drank sherry, but it seemed right for an occasion like this. Something special for a special moment. The conversation started with all the usual things. David's flight, his hotel, the weather, how different the town looked after so many years. Safe topics, the kind you use when you're finding your way. Back to each other after a long absence. "So, what brings you to our little corner of the world?" I asked, settling back into my favorite chair. "Work, mostly," David said. "I'm doing some consulting for a company here. Technology stuff, probably boring to anyone who doesn't live and breathe computers. Still working with computers then? Mark said. I remember when you first got interested in all that. Most of us didn't even know what a computer was. Times change, David said with a shrug. Though I have to admit, sometimes I miss the old days when everything was simpler. We talked about our children, Mark and I, proudly sharing stories about our daughter's new job and our son's recent graduation. David listened with genuine interest, asking questions. Remembering details from the Christmas cards we used to send when we asked about his family? David's expression shifted slightly. Divorced, he said simply. No kids, just me and my work, mostly. There was something sad in the way he said it. But he brightened quickly when Mark started telling stories about their college days. Soon they were both laughing, finishing each other's sentences, bringing up names and places I'd heard about but never experienced myself. I mostly listened, enjoying the sound of their laughter, the way they seemed to fall back into their old rhythm so easily. The room grew warmer as the sun set outside, casting long shadows across our carpet. The smell of the chicken from the kitchen mixed with the sweet scent of the sherry, creating an atmosphere that felt both cozy and nostalgic. It was during a quiet moment Mark had gone to refill his glass that David turned to me with a different look on his face. The jovial mood shifted, becoming something more serious, more intimate. You know, Sarah, he began, his voice softer now, more thoughtful. There's something I've been thinking about telling you. Well, telling both of you really for a very long time. I felt something flutter in my chest. Curiosity, maybe? Or perhaps a touch of worry. It's the way he said it. The sudden change in his tone made me lean forward slightly. I said, trying to keep my voice light. What's that, David? Mark came back into the room, holding his refilled glass, and immediately sensed the change in atmosphere. He looked from David to me, his brow furrowing slightly. What's going on? He asked, settling back into his chair. David took a slow sip of his sherry, his eyes holding mine for a moment before. Shifting to Mark, he swirled the amber liquid in his glass as if gathering his doubts, or perhaps his courage, the easy banter of a few minutes ago, had evaporated, replaced by a quiet anticipation that seemed to make the ticking of the grandfather clock. In Thial sound unusually loud. It's about your early days, David said, his gaze no fixed on some distant point beyond Thoindo. Specifically about something that happened right before you two got serious, something I'm not even sure Mark fully understood. The implications of Ath time, or maybe he did, and that's why never said anything. My heart gave a little thump. Our early days, that was a left time ago. A whirlwind of new love uncertainties, youthful dreams. What could David possibly know that I didn't? Or that Mark hadn't? Sharetti glanced at Mark. He looked as puzzled as I felt, a slight frown creasing his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but David raised a hand, slightly a gentle gesture, asking for patience. It involves a bit of a confession on my part, too. I suppose, David continued, airy little smile playing on his lips and looking back. Sarah, knowing what I know about how things turned out for you two, well, it just feels like something you should know, something that might cast a different light. On things, a different light on what things my min dressed our past was. Our past settled and understood, wasn't it? Or so I had always believed. The air in the room suddenly felt charged thick with unspoken words, and the weight of years I found myself folding. My breath waiting. David set his sherry glass down in the coaster with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness off the room. He looked at Mark, first a searching gaze, then his eyes met Minkind and steady. Mark, do you remember that awful flu you had? I think it was winter of your senior year. You were completely knocked out for over a week, missed a bunch of classes. Exams looming. Mark frowned inconcentrationally. Yeah, I think I do. It was a nasty one. Mom even threatened to drive down from Vermont to nurse me. Remember, hetcha cold lightly, but the sound was a little strained. He was clearly trying to understand where David was going with Easy. Remember it well, David, said his voice taking on a more serious tone, because you were supposed to be helping Sarah with something tingent port to her. He turned to me. Sarah Hugh. Probably don't recall this specifically, or maybe you do, but we're working on that big portfolio. For your art history class, the one that was a huge part of your final grade, you'd mentioned to Mark and to me because I was always around how stressed you were about getting the research done, especially for that section on early Renaissance patrons. The Universal Library was undergoing renovations, and half the books you needed were in off-site storage, almost impossible to access. Quickly, I did remember. Vaguely at first, then, with a growing clarity, that portfolio had been the bane of my existence for months. Professor Aubrey had been a stickler for obscure details, and I'd been desperate for a good gradato keep. My scholarship, I remembered Thepanek, the late nights, the feeling off by Unraveled. Yes, I said slowly, a remember thought. It was a nightmare. I was so worried I wouldn't get it done or wouldn't do it well enough. David nodded. Exactly, and Mark, bless his heart, had sworn up and down he'd help you. He was pretty good at digging through archives. Much better than you were at the time, if you don't mind me saying. Sarah, he gave me an apologetic smile. I waved a hand. No offense taken. He always was more patient with that stuff. Well, David continued, when he got sick, properly bedridden, delirious, half time he was beside himself with worry, not just about his own exams, but mostly about you, about letting you down with that research. I looked at Mark, a warmth spreading through me. I hadn't known he'd been that concerned back then. We were still finding our footing as a couple, record for each other deeply. But there was still that youthful self-absorption that often accompanies being 21. He kept muttering about it. David sighed, a faint smile on his lips, in between moans about his head exploding. Sarah's patrons find the Medici letters. She failed. It was quite a thopermance. Mark looked a little embarrassed. I don't remember any of that too. Wouldn't David said you were out off it, but here's the thing. Sarah heckled and do it. He couldn't help you, and he knew how much it meant to you. David paused, and his gaze became more direct, more intense. So I did it. I blinked. You did it. You did what the research David sent quietly for the Renaissance sopranos. I spent 3 solid afternoons in that dusty annex they called the Overflow Library, chasing down those obscure references you needed. I even managed to charm that old battle axe Opha librarian, Mrs. Henderson, into letting me into the restricted stacks, for Anne Horry stared at him, completely dumbfounded. Henderson. She was legendary for her fierceness. Charming her was a feat worthy of a medal. You did that research for me. Well, for Mark, really, David said a little comfortably. He was so agitated, I just wanted to calm him down. And honestly, I'd felt bad for you. To Sarah, you were always so kind to me, even when I was being a typical college wolfball inside. Mark and I knew how important that portfolio was. I was trying to process this, remembered vividly now how a few days before the deadline, a neatly typed CTOF notes and photocopied pages had appeared on my desk in the little apartment I shared with 2 other girls. There was no name on it. I'd asked my roommates. I even asked Mark once. He was vaguely coherent again. If he'd somehow managed it before he got sick. He looked confused and said no, he wished he could have. I just assumed one of my roommates had taken pity on me and maybe asked a senior student for help, or that I'd somehow misplaced my own earlier notes and rediscovered them. It was a mystery. Eventually shrugged off in their relief of getting the section done and earning an A on the paper, and that secured my scholarship. Those notes, whispered my voice, barely audible, the ones that just appeared. That was you. David nodded, a slight flush rising on his own cheeks. Now, Mark, madam, swear not to tell anyone, especially not you. He was still pretty out of it when I gave him festive to pass on, but he was lucid noto. Be adamant about Thoth said. He said he didn't want you to feel like you owed him anything, or Thoth was trying to buy your affection or some such noble, slightly dramatically boy reasoning. He just wanted you to have them to do well. He figured you choose to assume he'd somehow managed to get him to you before the fever really too cold. I turned to look at Mark. He was staring at David, then at me. His expression, a mixture of astonishment and something else. A dawning recollection. Perhaps his face was slowly turning a rather fetching shade of red. I honestly don't remember the specifics of telling you to keep it quiet, David. I remember you being there helping me out. The rest is a blur, but it sounds like something my younger, overly earnest self would do it. What's exactly what you did, David, affirmatively, and I kept my promise. For over 30 years I kept it, but seeing you both now so happy, so solid it, just felt like a piece of your story, Sarah, that you deserve to know it wasn't just a booth research. It was about how much Heckard, even then, even when he was too sick to say it or too well to mark to mock. A big deal of it, I felt the sting off tears in my eyes, my breath caught in me throat. It wasn't just the act off kindness, immense as it was. It was the selflessness behind it. The quiet protection, the fact that Mark had orchestrated this gesture, Afro found support, and then erased his own part in it, wanting no credit, only my sexes and peace of mind, and loyal David had been the silent keeper off this secret, this beautiful selfless act for all these decades. The room which had felt warm in cozy moments before no seemed to shimmer with an almost staggered light, the everyday setting of our living room with its familiar furniturian photographs chronicling our life together suddenly felt like a stage for a revelation of profound and quiet love. Couldn't speak, I just looked from David's kind, slightly nervous face to my host's, which was now a canvas of emotions. I was only just beginning to decipher. The air was thick, not with tension, but with a powerful resonating truth that had been waiting patiently in wings for its cue, and it had finale revived, leaving me utterly, completely brainless. My gaze was locked on Mark High's eyes, those familiar blue eyes that knew, as well as my own reflection, were filled with a complex mix of surprise, a touch of remembered embarrassment, and a deep, unwavering affection that made my heart swell. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. As an acknowledgement of the past David had just laid bare before us, his touch was warm grounding. I barely remember being that sick, let alone the details. Mark said, his voice a little rough. He looked at David. But I do remember you being a true friend, Dave, always. And Sarah, he turned it back to me, his thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. I guess I wanted you to succeed on your own merit. I knew how capable you were. I didn't want you to ever think I wastering to, manipulate things or make you feel ended. I finally found my voice, though it was shaky. Oh, Mark, never. I would have been so incredibly grateful. I was grateful to whoever thought had left those notes. I squeezed his hand. That it meant so much. It wasn't just about the grade. If I kept Miss scholarships without it, things would have been much harder. I remembered the constant low-level anxiety about finances. Back then, the careful budgeting, the fear of not being able to continue my studies, that anonymous help had been a lifeline. I hadn't even known I was being thrown her. By whom David smiled, a soft, understanding smile. He was pretty damn it, Sarah. Very noble, in a slight, clueless, 21-year-old kind of way, I think. Also didn't want you to know how much was already. Well, he guessed your between Mark and me. He was already head over heels, but he was trying to play it's cool. Mark groaning good-naturedly. Was that obvious tone? Yes, David chuckled to Sarah. Oh, maybe not quite so much. She seemed to have you on a bit of a string there for a while, if I recall. I felt a blush creep up my neck again, but this time it was mixed with a profound tenderness. Think of young Mark, so deeply smitten, wanting to help me, so desperately but also wanting me to shine independently. It was a portrait of him I hadn't fully seen before. Layer of his character that had been hidden for me all these years. It wasn't a grand dramatic gesture, but a quiet act of profound care and respect. And that somehow made it all the more meaningfully. Never knew, I said softly, looking at Mark. All these years you've never said a word. He shrugged, a characteristic of his when he was down playing Zemming. Honestly, Sarah, as David said, I barely remembered the specifics once. Eerie covered, and then, well, we had so many things happening, didn't we? Life moved on, we fell in love. Really fell in love, got married, built a life. That one little incident, it just faded into the background. I guess it was just something I did, or rather something David helped do for the girl I was crazy about, it wasn't. A little incident, Mark, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It was showed. It was foundational. It showed me. Ashos. Me even now the kind of man. You were the kind of man you've, Allie Bean, the setting sun, was now painting the room in deeper hues of orange. And purple, the earlier coziness, had transformed into something richer, deeper, like the aged cherry in our glass it felt as though a missing piece of our shared history had just clicked into place, illuminating the past and, in doing so, casting a new, more vibrant light on the present. David, bless him, seemed to sensate. We needed a moment. He cleared his throat gently. Well, I should probably think about heading off, but an early start, as I said. He stood up and Mark and I rose with him. David, thank you, I said, stepping forward and giving him a hug, a proper one this time. Thank you for what you did back then. And thank you for telling me. It means more than I can say. I'm glad I did. He said, his voice insert. It always felt like a story that belonged to both of you. And Mark headed to my husband, a mischievous glint back in his eye. You owe me one, a big one, for keeping all these years and forfeiting Mrs. Henderson's wrath, Mark Laud. A full hearty sound that fell through. I absolutely do. Next time you're in town, dinner is on me, the fanciest placeo can think of. And no talk of old library battles. I promise. They embrace a Dagon. The easy camaraderie of lifelong friends re-established. Yet subtly Depani B, the Bennings revelation, Mark, walked David to the door. I could hear their voices a little quieter now as they said their goodbyes, son. The porch. I stood by the window, watching David's car pull away from the curb and disappear. Down the street, third tail lights shrinking into the twilight. The street lights flickered on, casting pools of light on the sidewalk. When Mark came back inside, Heck closed the door softly and then just stood there for a moment looking at Methawaz. A question in his eyes, a vulnerability that was incredibly endearing. Walked over to him, cupping his face in my hands. You, Mark Henderson, I said, my voice still trembling slightly, are an extraordinary man. He leaned into my touch, his eyes searching mine. So I'm forgiven for my youthful secrecy. Forgiven. I smiled, tears welling up again, but these were tears of pure and unadulterated joy and love. There's nothing to forgive. It's a gift learning this. Now, after all this time, it's like finding a hidden treasure in our out backyard. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. A rhythm that had been the soundtrack to my life for over 3 decades, but tonight it sounded different, fuller, each Beatricenating with a depth of love and commitment that I now understood had roots even deeper than I had. Avromagined, we stood there for a long time, just holding each other, the aroma of Thenno slightly over-roasted chicken forgotten, the silence of the even wrapping around us like a warm embracethi. Surprise of David's story had indeed left me breathless, but as I stood therein, Mark's arms, what filled my lungs, what filled my heart, was an overwhelming snooze of gratitude, a renewed appreciation for the quiet, steadfast love that had been the bedrock of our lives all along. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound declarations of love aren't spoken in grand pronouncements, but are whispered in selfless actions hidden in the everyday fabric of a shared life, waiting patiently to be discovered even decades later. And when they are, they have the power to take your breath away. All over again. The evening had started as a simple reunion, a casual visit from an old friend. It ended as a quiet testamento, the enduring power of unspoken love and the beautiful surprises that a long life lived together can still hold. Ich knew as I held Mark tighter that this drew David's gift to us would become a third cherished chapter in the story of us. A reminder that even after all this years, there were still wonderful things to learn about the man I loved, Dan, that I realized was a truly incredible thing. The discovery wasn't just about a past event, it was about understanding the enduring consistency of character, a quiet strength and selflessness that had been there from start, a thread woven so deeply into the tapestry of our life. Toga Therrit made me feel cherished, not just for woe I was now, but for the young woman I had been with all her dreams and anxieties, and it made me love him, if it were even possible, more than